Good afternoon, everybody. It is lovely to see you here at our IIRSM Yorkshire and Humber branch meeting. It's the first one I've done as the chair of the committee, and I'm delighted to be here, having met with the Yorkshire branch participants recently, and also had some of your feedback from the recent survey we sent out on what you were hoping to see more of from our branch meetings and from our webinars and presentations. I think one of the things that did come up, which was great to see, was environmental. So, we're delighted to have with us today Tama, who is going to talk to us about opportunities in net zero, as part of meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals. How do we do that? How do we actually take that forward in our own workplaces? So we're delighted that Tama is going to talk through that with us today. Just before she does that, though, I just want to mention that we do have our next presentation booked in for November, so keep an eye out on social media for that and on your mailing lists. We've got a gentleman from the HC who's going to be talking to us about musculoskeletal in the workplace, which again, very hot topic, so very excited about that. If you do have any questions in today's session, then we're going to take those questions and give them some answers towards the end of the session, which we're very grateful for. So just pop any questions that you have in the Q&A, and that will be much appreciated. But I am going to hand over to Tama, and she is going to introduce herself much more fully than I could, and give us a very, very interesting presentation on net zero. So thank you very much. Over to you, Tama.
Thank you, Heather. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. We have about 45 minutes for a session, and then, as Heather mentioned, I'll take some questions at the end of it. But I'd like to take you on a little journey this lunchtime through environmental compliance in the context of net zero, and the regulatory landscape, which might kind of set the foundation for you to anticipate what's to come and kind of the implications that that would have for you and your organizations. You might be able to tell from my accent that I'm not originally from the UK. I'm currently based in Newcastle upon Tyne, and I work within the IIRSM branch for the Northeast and Cumbria. So I'm really delighted to be a guest speaker for you today. In my day job, I work as an environmental consultant, but that covers a number of different things. I would say that my primary specialism is working with organizations to implement management systems to help them achieve their environmental and sustainability objectives. I do that through some of the recognized frameworks like B Corp, ISO 14001, EcoVadis, or any kind of other framework that is well recognized. But through those processes of implementing management systems and actually helping businesses to do environmental management, I've developed a bit of a niche specialism around environmental legislation and how that gives us a really good idea of what we should be considering as we develop these strategies, taking regulatory compliance as kind of a stakeholder expectation that we would need to demonstrate compliance against. What I do know in my experience of management systems is legislation is pretty difficult for businesses to access, understand, interpret, and demonstrate. And that's where iCore comes in as a tool, a SaaS-based solution that allows organizations to navigate that process. I'm not going to talk too much on it, but just to explain how the interventions can be achieved, it's really about understanding what your business does, what environmental legislation applies to your activities, and then more importantly, what you need to do to demonstrate compliance. I'm fundamentally a scientist, and I'm all about the evidence in environmental management and that validation and that verification. So that's the journey that I like to take my clients on. So I've got a bit of an ambitious agenda for 45 minutes. But I really enjoy environmental legislation. I like unpacking it, and I think it's quite interesting once you understand the principles of legislation, as I say, in terms of driving forward sustainability strategies and helping you make better informed choices about what steps are ultimately going to be beneficial towards sustainability. So I'd like to start a little bit of background, some of the principles of environmental legislation. I'm going to introduce some of the regulatory landscape for net zero, and then again talk to you about the steps that you can take within your own organizations in terms of how you can begin to ensure environmental compliance and continue to manage it as it changes, because it will change. And that is kind of the nature of science and the nature of legislation, specifically in relation to environmental management and sustainability. So I know legislation has a pretty bad rep, actually. I work with a lot of businesses, sometimes hailed as red tape. It can be expensive, it can be difficult, and there's absolutely no point in sugarcoating that. But fundamentally, environmental legislation exists for only one reason. All environmental legislation has had to be created in order to protect the natural environment from human activities, ultimately in order to ensure human health and well-being. The environment sustains us, and therefore we have to protect it from the activities of businesses and individual activities, actually, to be fair, to make sure that it can continue to sustain us. It's about protecting our most fundamental needs: clean air, clean food, clean water, and somewhere safe to live. So sometimes when you're navigating the red tape and it can feel very frustrating, I find it somewhat comforting to come back to there's a good reason why it's difficult. We're trying to do a difficult thing to ultimately protect the natural environment. Now, the background of legislation is always founded in some fundamental principles. There's actually 5 principles. And again, I feel in understanding the principles, it allows us to begin to anticipate what regulation is likely to look like in the future. So you can kind of draw connections to what impact it's likely to have on your organization. So the first principle is something called the polluter pays principle. Remember, we're trying to protect the natural environment, and pollution is not good for the natural environment. The polluter pays principle suggests that organizations that are responsible for causing pollution should pay to prevent it, to clean it up, and to limit it, inhibit it from happening in the future. We see this coming through in terms of some of the waste management legislation, but also stuff that will ultimately end up in the waste stream. So we see this implemented through the packaging regulations, where if you put packaging onto the market, which ultimately becomes the waste stream, you actually have to pay for its ultimate disposal at the point you put it on the market. We see that with electrical equipment too. So this typically targets the products and services that are most likely to cause pollution, and is asking businesses to think about at the design stage, how do we prevent it from causing pollution through its life cycle? The fundamental kind of line of that is, if your activities are going to cause pollution, it's likely the costs associated with that are going to increase quite significantly over the next couple of years. Another principle that underpins all environmental legislation is something called the best available technique. And again, this means that individuals and organizations should always find the best available technique, the best available way to control and minimize pollution associated with their activities. Now, what the best available technique is can change over time with new technology, new science, new understanding around the impacts that our activities actually have on the environment. And again, this then puts a burden on organizations and individuals to understand and to kind of keep up with technology, to keep up with the best available techniques that are most relevant to their activities and services, in order to ultimately prevent pollution. Another principle that is implemented through legislation is something called the proximity principle. So back in the day, the start of all of the awareness around environmental legislation, well, environmental impact really, was that we could just throw stuff away, send it away, out of sight, out of mind. and it isn't something that we have to deal with. It's not our problem. What we've learned over the years, again through scientific advancement, is that there is no way when we live in a finite planet, one planet. Everything is fundamentally connected. Everything affects us at a global level as well as a local level, and therefore the proximity principle essentially says if you cause a problem, you have to deal with it within your area, within your remit. We cannot outsource our environmental impact. This is something we have to take ownership of, and again, fundamentally try to reduce the impact that it ultimately has on the environment. And the final principle is this principle of prevention and control. So overall, every piece of environmental legislation says that the environment must be protected as a whole. We need to think about how we impact it holistically, and that we have an obligation to ultimately prevent pollution, not just to control it. So permitting arguably allows you to pollute within kind of limits, but ultimately we're going to try and prevent that completely. What we're also seeing coming through this idea of prevention control is through international frameworks and international agreements. And again, kind of as science is evolving in terms of what it would really take to achieve net zero, we're also now saying prevention, control, it's not good enough. What legislation needs to strive us to do is actually to enhance nature. So if we give nature back some capacity, she might rebalance, the impact that our activities are having, because again, it's one finite planet with all of these biological, physical, and chemical processes that are actually connected to each other. So I definitely think that future legislation, as well as I said, this control and prevention, is ultimately going to say you have to put nature back to a level the same, if not higher, than how you found it, than what it essentially was. So I think if you can kind of fundamentally understand those principles, it becomes easy to predict, to see that future of legislation could be very expensive if we don't take steps to prevent the impact that we have on the environment, that we have an obligation to take ownership of our own impact, and that is likely to open up a requirement for broader engagement with our supply chain, and that prevention and control are not sufficient, that ultimately regeneration and the restoration of nature is going to become something that we'd all need to integrate into our net zero strategies. Just a little bit of background in terms of legislative structure. I don't want to delve on this too much, but the thing to note is that none of this is actually new. A lot of the things we see coming through environmental legislation have been agreed through international treaties or agreements decades ago. So this is a long-term objective. We've known this was coming for a long time. Unfortunately, we're just a little bit slow to action, but that's not to say that there hasn't been significant progress over the last couple of years anyway. Now, the thing to note is that the UK is a signatory on all of these agreements. So the UK in its own right has committed to achieving net zero ultimately in line with the Paris Agreement to keep global warming levels below that 1.5 degrees centigrade threshold. Now, how legislation comes into existence is from those international treaties and agreements. What used to happen was that it used to go to the EU, where they would interpret the requirements of those agreements and determine what the regulatory framework would look like for its member countries. And that would then filter through to the UK, and the UK would then implement that through an act or a statutory instrument. Now, the EU exit happened, and obviously that removed the role of the EU in terms of determining our legal compliance for the future. However, we're still a signatory at those international levels. So whatever was agreed at that international level, despite the fact that it's not going to go through the EU, it is still going to be something that the UK is going to have to achieve through its regulatory process. The other thing to note is that although Brexit happened a little while ago, almost seems like a long time ago, it wasn't. And a lot of the legislation was ultimately retained. So it hasn't really changed what our overarching environmental responsibilities are in the UK and in terms of our relationship with the EU, and obviously broader than that. At that point in time, every piece of law that had originally come from the EU got automatically transposed into the UK, and we are working through a process of determining what we're keeping and what we're not keeping, as well as what's being updated to help the UK meet its own regulatory responsibilities. Now, what's interesting about that is just general awareness around how legislation changes and the impact that that has for organizations. So it was quite interesting when this came through. The British Chamber of Commerce surveyed nearly 1,000 of its businesses, and broad awareness of how those changes in the EU regulatory landscape would affect local businesses, UK businesses, was actually pretty low. Only 4% of businesses said that they comprehensively understood the impact of this change. A quarter broadly knew that it exists. 41% knew nothing that was in it, and 30% didn't even know that this bill had come through. From a business perspective, it's about risk management. I think it is safe to say that we are going to see a lot of change coming through the regulatory framework in the future. We've got a new government now. We've still got these overarching net zero targets. And I think broadly public awareness of how net zero needs to be a priority is going to put a lot of pressures on the government and on businesses to progress this as quickly as possible towards net zero. And we're starting to see the change coming through the regulatory landscape in terms of what that means for businesses. So that's kind of the history of legislation in a nutshell. I hope that is beneficial. It's obviously really difficult to talk about thousands of pieces of environmental legislation, but as I said earlier, I think if you can just hone in on those principles, a lot of what comes through will make more sense to you because you'll understand the implications and more likely what you're going to need to work in line with that legislation. What I'd like to do next is kind of give you, again, a very high level overview of the regulatory landscape for net zero and kind of what we're seeing right now and what we're anticipating in the not too distant future. I would like to just start this section off with defining a carbon footprint, because when we talk about the journey towards net zero, carbon footprinting, carbon accounting comes up as the way that we achieve net zero. This is what every business has to do to understand what they have to do. But what I find in practice is that there's still quite a lot of misconceptions about what a carbon footprint is, what it tells us about the impact that we have on the environment, what we can do with it, what it actually means. So despite the fact that we talk about a carbon footprint, the key thing to note is that typically what businesses are measuring is not just carbon. The carbon footprint is technically a greenhouse gas footprint. So there are several gases, of which carbon is one, that is encompassed in that measurement. And those measurements were defined, those gases even, are defined in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol as having to be measured for your carbon footprint to be scientifically accurate, scientifically valid, as far as is practicable at this point in time. So it is a total set of greenhouse gas emissions caused directly and indirectly by an organization's activities, products, or services. We typically see that expressed as carbon dioxide equivalent, so that's CO2e. And the reason for that is it just gives us something much simpler to talk about, but it should never just be carbon. It should always be all greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this journey actually started as far back as 1987, when we started to understand how certain gases had an impact on the environment and started to cause this greenhouse gas effect, which ultimately causes global warming, which ultimately causes climate change. So it goes as far back as 1987 to the Montreal Protocol, which is where we first decided to remove CFCs from public use, to impact the limit on, to limit the impact on the ozone layer and the consequences of greenhouse gas emissions. In 2005, we saw the Kyoto Protocol come through, and that was the first legally binding climate treaty. So about 20 years ago, just shy of 20 years ago, was when we agreed to minimize the impacts of climate change. It started to put responsibility on us to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. But there was some complexity around that in terms of adopters and what it meant. But it laid the foundation for what came next. From the Kyoto Protocol in the UK, we then saw the Climate Change Act come in 2008. And this was the UK leading the charge, actually, in being the first country to legally commit to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to at least 80% of a 1990 baseline by 2050. So this is already, without the terminology, this was already progress towards net zero, taking us quite a long way back in terms of our carbon emissions. And it asked the government to continue to review how climate change is likely to affect the UK and to continue to review those targets to make sure that we were always striving to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So 2008 saw this come in. And then in 2015, we really saw a turning point in terms of carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and the obligations that we all had to meet really to actually reduce our impact. So in 2015, the Paris Agreement, which is one of those international agreements of which the UK is a signatory, was ratified. And this was ultimately a global agreement that required all signatories to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to net zero to ensure that we were able to not exceed a global warming of 1.5 degrees. So the background here is that this has existed for a long time. After the Paris Agreement, we then saw a change to our Climate Change Act, which came in 2019. And this is the first time that net zero was specified. So from an 80% reduction to 100% reduction back to that 1990 baseline. And again, in this situation, the UK was kind of leading the charge and being the first to make this legally binding commitment towards achieving net zero. This was obviously just at the beginning of COVID. It was quite significant for businesses at a very difficult time. And obviously that means its implementation and interpretation over the last couple of years is still very much a work in progress, although we have seen some changes to legislation come through as a result of it. Now, this is just an example in the UK of all of the regulations that already existed that aimed to get us to improve our energy performance and to ultimately reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And these regulations affect different businesses in different ways, depending on your activities, products, and services. But what we saw come in after that 2019 change and this commitment to net zero was the first streamlined energy and carbon reporting regulations. So this was the first time in the UK where a legal requirement was put on large organizations, so anybody over 250 employees with a turnover of more than £36 million, had now a legal obligation to measure their annual greenhouse gas emissions in a carbon report and to publish it, to make it publicly available within their financial reports that are submitted to both HMRC and made available on Companies House. And this is kind of pushing this idea of measuring carbon is quite difficult, takes a little bit of getting used to, definitely needs some systems to be implemented to help keep on top of it. So it kind of pushed businesses towards figuring out how ready they were to actually measure their carbon footprint and make sure that they put those systems in place. And then also to report it, to become transparent about your greenhouse gas emissions and the impact that that has on the environment. And what we're seeing, the changes coming from that point is very much around, now you've measured it, where are your reduction opportunities? What are you going to do to start reducing your greenhouse gas emissions? And again, pushing that through, looking at your own activities up and down your supply chain, and that proximity principle. How do we bring things closer to us so that we can better control the carbon emissions associated with it? This has been a really significant piece of legislation, regulated by HMRC as opposed to your typical environmental regulators. And as I say, it definitely taught businesses a lot about their readiness to measure and report their carbon emissions. And we're definitely seeing change afoot for what comes next in this particular piece of legislation. Now, it's not been without complexity. So our government did actually get themselves sued in terms of their own net zero strategy, because what had been suggested was that their initial plan wasn't actually a plan. They had this overarching commitment to achieve net zero, but no strategy, no plan. They were taken by Client Earth to the High Court to say that their plan was not sufficient, and the court agreed. So from that, the government has had to go back to the drawing board and really is required now legally from the High Court to continue to look at what the UK's net zero strategy looks like and how do we improve the integrity and robustness of that strategy for individuals and organizations to be able to navigate it. One thing that is inherent in terms of how net zero needs to progress from the regulatory perspective is what is measured and how it's measured. So, tiny background in carbon footprinting. When you follow the methodologies, the protocols on how to do a carbon footprint, it asks you to break your greenhouse gas emissions up into different scopes. Scope 1 and Scope 2 is essentially all of your energy consumption that you use directly within your own organization. Scope 3 is everything else. That includes waste, water, contractors, transport, distribution, products out in the real world. Scope 1 and Scope 2 is gas, electricity, fuels that you use within your building. Now, legally, businesses are only required to report Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions at the moment. Scope 3 has always been a bit of a Pandora's box that a lot of businesses are, cautious about opening up. I think the government's also cautious about opening it up. But the truth is we cannot achieve net zero if we're only looking at energy consumption that is directly used by organizations. We do need to start to dig in to that Scope 3. And this is what we're now seeing being chatted about, is this idea of embodied or embedded carbon. So there's the greenhouse gas emissions you can measure from your energy. What about everything else? What about every product, activity, service that starts before your organization and ends after your organization? So we're seeing this idea of product footprinting coming through thick and fast in legislation, specifically around environmental declarations on products and services, but also in terms of what Scope 3 is likely to expand into and where the legal obligation for reporting as far as Scope 3 goes means that most businesses are going to have to take what we call a life cycle perspective. So to think about literally the life cycle, where do things begin, where do they end, what happens in between, and what are we able to measure, and where are the opportunities for carbon reduction as a consequence. As I've mentioned, we do need to dig into this. In my experience in completing carbon footprints, what I have found with my clients, and this is definitely true across a number of other consultants and what the science is telling us about carbon footprinting as it is that Scope 1 and Scope 2 is literally the tip of the iceberg, that the actual greenhouse gas emissions associated with organizational activities sit within the supply chain, sit within Scope 3, and that can account for anywhere between 20 to 99% of the actual greenhouse gas emissions. So for most organizations, if we are only reporting and we are only setting net zero targets against Scope 1 or Scope 2, that is potentially only 1% of our actual impact. So again, although that's where the legislation is at the moment, and if you are already obligated, if you are already reporting on your scope 1 and scope 2, a way to anticipate what's coming is to begin to unpack scope 3 at your own pace. See what you can measure, because again, it is a reasonable prediction that we're going to see some obligations come through the legislation in terms of including scope 3 emissions within your reporting. And again, that scope 3 is almost directly associated to what we call science-based targets that ultimately strive to achieve the Paris Agreement, that we're going to try and limit global warming to that 1.5 degree centigrade threshold. Again, through national systems, national frameworks, those international frameworks, this idea of embodied, embedded carbon, those scope 3 emissions, supply chain engagement, life cycle consideration, we're talking about the same thing. I think there are a lot of words, you know, around what sustainability is in practice. I think this kind of life cycle consideration is the best encompassing term that would include scope 3, embodied or embedded carbon, supply chain engagement, or that kind of stuff. But as I said, it really is what it says on the tin. You're trying to think about from the very beginning, how do we research and design products? Where do we get our materials from? How do they travel? What do we do with them? How do we get them out to our customers? What do our customers do with them? And then eventually what happens to them at the end of their life? And thinking about opportunities to prevent pollution and ultimately regenerate the environment at each point in that process. And this takes us, again, another term we see talking around this principle is, you know, the circular economy, this transformation of how we process, use, consume, and dispose of products, taking it away from a linear cycle, which unfortunately has been the cause for a lot of the environmental challenges that we're facing nowadays, and turning it into a circular process where we rethink everything about how we do it to minimize that impact to ultimately regenerate nature. If you've not come across the term circular economy, I do recommend digging around, because again, this pretty much taps into all of these themes, all of these concepts around net zero. The circular economy at its simplest term is about eliminating waste and pollution in all of our activities, products, and services, taking a life cycle perspective, looking for ways to keep materials and products in circulation for as long as possible at their absolute highest value, and ultimately helping nature regenerate. So from there, hopefully you can see the link back to some of those environmental principles and the journey of legislation that has got us to this point of figuring out what net zero means to us. And again, we can see circularity coming through the legislation. So in 2021, we got the Environment Act. And one of the key things around this is the waste and resource efficiency requirements, which make us look as products in a circular way. And then the nature, biodiversity, and conservation requirements, which ultimately begins to introduce these principles of regeneration to the environment. We also saw the circular economy package regulations come in. So this was like an overarching piece of legislation that basically changed all the existing waste legislation to begin to think about how we recover materials at their highest value at the end of life. So there's a lot of change coming from a lot of different directions, but ultimately the principles of what all of it's trying to achieve is the same. And although it might seem a little intimidating, the science, the you know, kind of reports and the data that we have in terms of the opportunity around net zero says that ultimately the benefits of investing in net zero today significantly outweigh the potential future costs. Net zero can materially improve people's lives, and it remains the absolute right target for the UK, which is backed by science, widely followed, and is creating opportunity. So this is what is driving us forwards. So we are making good time. I've got about 10 minutes left, so I'll be wrapping up in this next section now. I've taken you through kind of the background in environmental legislation. I've covered, the key principles around net zero, what that means and how we're seeing things change over time, which will hopefully put you in a position to be able to anticipate what some of the implications will be for your organization. I just want to kind of close off and give you some hints and tips in terms of how you can keep on top of this in terms of ensuring compliance and keeping pace with the change of science, technology and legislation insofar as it applies to net zero. Now, obviously, legislation is a really strong driver for what businesses have to consider. As I said at the beginning, it's a really good thing to feed into helping you make decisions about what your net zero sustainability, environmental improvement programs are likely to look like. But you might also find you're getting pressure from a couple of different directions. So again, from a risk management perspective, from a business continuity perspective, and from being able to meet your stakeholder expectations, it would be a good idea to get ahead of this. So kind of to do things at your own pace, begin to figure out how to measure it before someone asks for it. Because when someone does ask for it, and that's almost an inevitability that someone will at some point, you're ready for it. You've got something to give them and you can show them the steps that you're taking towards figuring out what all of this means to you. Might be driven from key clients. It's definitely part of due diligence for large, complicated supply chains. Tier 1 suppliers are definitely driving this forward. A lot of organizations are mandating it, that you can't even, work with them, like the NHS, like Marks and Spencers, like some of the big automotive manufacturers. Part of your tendering process is submitting your carbon footprint. Obviously, depending on where you're located, there might be some specific regulatory, local authority kind of legal requirements. And also, if you are running any kind of accredited management system, like I mentioned, ISO 14001, EcoVadis, B Corp, or any of the other frameworks, part of those frameworks ask you to understand, access, interpret, and demonstrate legal compliance. So there's a lot of drivers for organizations. In order of getting on top of it, I'm all about process. So what you learn through management systems is definitely beneficial in this. Figure out how you want to do things, how you're going to access information, set it up as a standard operating procedure that is teachable and repeatable and auditable so that you can continue to improve and you can continue to demonstrate compliance. One of the tricks around that, though, is obviously maintaining awareness of the legislation. So what your process needs to include is a way to identify applicable legislation, both local and kind of national and international, if that applies to you. The process of assessing and understanding it. So with the legislation, the real question is, well, what does this mean and what am I supposed to do about it? Wherever you're supposed to do something, that in itself should become a standard operating procedure. So this is how we manage waste. This is how we manage air emissions. This is how we complete our carbon footprint every year, to ensure that, again, we get consistent, reliable management pollution prevention processes. Obviously, communication is key in any process, making sure that the right people have the right information to do what we need them to do when we need them to do it, to keep records, and to be able to collect evidence to show that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. Keeping on top of actions progress, so whether that's PDCA processes, whether that's monitoring and measuring, whether that's monthly objectives and targets, whatever mechanism works for you. How do we prove that we're moving forwards? Again, bring it back to that scientific evidence that we can validate. Auditing is really key in this. So I really do believe that taking a walk around, really critiquing what you do, how you do it, why you do it, and kind of putting yourself in the perspective of, if someone asked us how we're doing this, what would we show them to demonstrate compliance confidently, so that we know we're doing the right thing, but they also know that we're doing the right thing. And do keep on top of it. I wish I could say, that this doesn't require some continuous effort. It does. Legislation changes, varying, speeds. Some months are very quiet, some months are really busy. But what we do know is because of the regulatory background towards net zero, this is going to remain a high priority for our government. And therefore, we should continue to anticipate that we are going to see changes in the future that affect our activities and operations. Some good places to go and find some more information if you're not familiar with these. Legislation.gov is the source of truth. So absolutely every piece of legislation in the UK gets published here. You can access it. And this is a good way to start to figure out what applies in different regions. As you can see in the image here, like there's different legislation for the UK, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. Obviously, we're still monitoring EU regulation because of that retained bill. And you can also search for environmental topics or health and safety topics or any other topics that you might find interesting just to see what's changing. You can also sign up to an RSS feed, so specific notifications can come through to your inbox if you're particularly interested in that. If you're in Scotland or Northern Ireland, NetRegs is a great resource. So in addition to the legislation, they also publish guidance documents, which is kind of the interpretation of the legislation. What does it mean for you? What are you supposed to do about it? This is a free resource. It's brilliant, but unfortunately, it only covers Scotland and Northern Ireland legislation, so it's not useful for England and Wales, although there are some commonalities in how legislation is implemented. Obviously, the Environment Agency is the ultimate regulator for the environment, so you are able to contact them, speak to them, ask for advice if you have specific questions about your activities and whether it's likely to have an impact from a legal perspective. I always encourage openness, proactiveness, and transparency with the regulators. They actually do want to help you. So, that's their job. They are there to support you. They are there to protect the environment. So do feel free to reach out to them. And then, of course, there's IIRSM, a digital system that kind of does all of that for you. If anybody has any further questions on that, I would be more than happy to organize a chat after this to talk about the solution. So I've just about got this bang on time. Quite an ambitious agenda, as I mentioned earlier, for 45 minutes, but we've done it. We've been on a journey from the foundational principles in environmental legislation. I've given you an overview of the regulatory landscape for net zero and hopefully left you with some hints and tips in terms of how you can begin to access and understand this and continue to ensure environmental compliance. Be more than happy to take questions now if there are any. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to me afterwards and I'd be more than happy to set up a chat. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tama. I'm amazed you managed to cover so much in 45 minutes and coherently as well. And we do have one question to start us off with, and that question is, do you see more actions required to report and reduce the Scope 3 emissions?
It's definitely coming. So science-based targets, again, it's another kind of like framework that a lot of organizations are trying to make sense of at the moment. And science-based targets specify reductions in those Scope 3 categories. So what I'm seeing is some of my larger clients are subscribing themselves to science-based initiatives, science-based targets in terms of reducing it. And the way that they do that is to push it through their supply chain. So they're taking their targets and then they're also setting targets for their primary or principal suppliers. And that's the difference. It's not just a measurement, it's a reduction target. So it's not mandated yet. It's not a legal requirement. Most of this is being implemented through voluntary standards or frameworks that businesses are subscribing to. But I think, the real world impact of that is if a business has made a decision that that's what it wants to see through the supply chain, it's just as kind of powerful as the regulation. It's still something that their supply chain is going to have to rise to meet. I don't know what degree they'll put it in legislation, but again, there is a lot of pressure on them in terms of ensuring they have a robust strategy to set specific targets around 3, because potentially 99% of the actual impact. So we can't ignore it.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've got another one around the around phase 3 submissions. So with ESOS phase 3 submissions now submitted, what do you expect the EA to do in terms of the action plan updates that are required annually?
So I mean, that's what it is at the moment. There has to be an annual action plan to reduce ESOS. And again, that's taken a long while. So this is phase 4 of ESOS. You know, this has been going for over, well, 12 years, because it's kind of 4-year phases. And what it did was say, measure, 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 now reduce. You know, you can kind of see that journey through the legislation. There is a bit of debate in the background, and there's been some consultations on this in terms of whether ESOS and SECR, the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting regs, should be merged in some way to kind of create a more coherent system, because both of them are obligations for large businesses. They kind of ask the same thing, but then it's also a little bit different. So it's actually like a double effort for organizations to comply with both. So there's consultations on that, and truthfully, that is what I predict, that they might stop existing individually, and we're going to see some kind of merging in them. But again, I anticipate that the requirement for an action plan will be inherent, however that plays out.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that question, Helen. So we don't have any more questions. I wondered that if people, I think we've just got another question, and so let's go to this question. So this one's from John. So does the iCore platform integrate ISO 9001 and 45001 with 14001?
So it's purely legislation. At the moment, it's environmental legislation, but we are building a health and safety module for it. So yes, it will. At the moment, it covers environmental legislation, but it is going to cover health and safety legislation in the not too distant future. And then actually integrating the 9001 requirements after that shouldn't be too challenging. So it's very much, the way it's been built is very much around how ISO asks you to do management, regardless of what you're managing. So the practical application of it is very functional. It is very practical. It's very action and evidence-based. And yeah, purely legislation, trying to make it just a little bit more accessible and a little more engaging for organizations. But I'd be more than happy to have a chat with you afterwards about kind of timelines for health and safety and whether that would be beneficial for you.
Great, thanks, Tamer. Tamer's contact details are up on the screen, or you can connect with her on LinkedIn, or if you don't catch either of those, you can contact me at branches@IIRSM.org, and I'll happily pass on your details. So whilst you're thinking of more questions, I was going to ask if anyone's got an interest in net zero generally, do you recommend any books for people to read?
Ooh.
Is that too tough?
No, I think kind of books, like there is a lot, I think actually it's some of the older stuff, the foundational literature that came through around the complexity of sustainability. So again, one thing that is probably worth mentioning at the moment is net zero greenhouse gas emissions. They're only kind of one problem out of several that need to be addressed for that kind of overarching environmental protection. So I think in terms of understanding what we'd have to do and why we have to do it, I actually think broader sustainability knowledge, trying to see all the interconnectedness and the complexities of environmental issues, because water isn't necessarily captured in greenhouse gas emissions. The consequences of waste and pollution we don't see in a carbon footprint. And it's a bigger picture. Carbon's only one metric in that. So I would try obviously follow current content on this. And I do think science-based targets have some excellent resources out there. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is all around circularity, has some excellent resources to try and understand this. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which again are an international agreement of, 17 of the world's biggest problems that need to be solved. If you can kind of broaden your perspective and then apply the net zero lens as kind of one step to take towards sustainability.
That was a very good answer for a really wide question. Sorry, Tama.
That's okay. I like it. I like a challenge.
And then we've got one last question. So I'm going to try and read this correctly. So it says, are you familiar with OGMP 2.0 standards and how this moves forward in reduction towards scope 3 ? Currently more to scope 1 and scope 2.
I am not familiar with the specific standard, but I'm not surprised that at the moment it's, kind of more focused on scope 1 and scope 2, because the truth is they all are. The legislation is very much focused on scope 1 and scope 2. Minimum mandatory reporting is scope 1 and scope 2 for everybody at the moment. As I said, I think there's been a lot of trepidation about opening, scope 3 and really what that means. So yes, it probably is biased. That doesn't surprise me, because that tracks with where we're at the moment. But if it's a framework that you're using and that works for you and that you understand and that is helping you get on top of scope 1 and scope 2, use the opportunity, like I say, to begin to foray a little bit into scope 3 and just start the question, with what could we measure? Could we measure our waste? Could we measure our water? Could we measure our raw materials? And, start with the stuff that is available to you. And in asking those questions, you'll then also begin to figure out what might be a little bit more challenging in your kind of future strategy. But if you're doing scope 1 and scope 2, then try a little of scope 3. That would be my advice.
That's great advice. We do often have people that are not UK based, so it may be a legislation that's based in the Middle East. Okay, so I think that's all the questions. Thank you so much, Tama. As always, you give an excellent presentation. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. I'd like to thank you particularly for your time and sharing your expertise with us. Please don't hesitate to reach out to Tama if you'd like to discuss things in more detail.
Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
See you at the next meeting. Bye.